With Stage 3 ending last month and the final phase of Stage 4 this month, we thought it was a good idea to talk about pro player builds. So today we're going to cover that in an analysis and try to explain why they choose a weapon and why they build it that way. We're going to be covering a few of them because you don't want to watch an hour and 30-minute long video. Just for context, pros don't want to use visible lasers and they can use every skin in the game thanks to the esports version. Starting with the Fennec, the way it was used was with a close to max mobility build, and the goal was to exploit the ultra CQC potential of the Fennec, mainly because the SX9 was still widely used in ranked, so trying to use a Fennec after the 10 to 15 meter mark wasn't a great idea because an SX9 would have just shredded you. Now that the SX9 isn't much used because of its slightly worse performances, there isn't an SMG that can counter the Fennec when we try to maximize its mid-range potential, apart from the QQ9, which isn't much used despite its incredible performances. A lot of pros understood that quickly. We see mostly two different builds. The first one with steady stock, and usually players run it with the Gung Ho perk, and the second one with extended barrel, and players run it with the toughness perk. The Fennec is still the best weapon at close range with those two builds, but it can still win gunfights up to about 20 meters against CBR4 or even ARs. And because they are pro players, they easily can use a Fennec to laser someone at that range, which isn't necessarily something everyone would be able to do. But to be fair, this build is solid, but we'd recommend you to try out the first one because you're not forced to use toughness. For this gun, there isn't one or two specific builds, there is a base and then people build it slightly differently. But here are a few that we took from Stage 4 in EU and NA mostly. And we're gonna take these as examples. To describe how pros use the HVK-30, they do not use it as a flex AR but a passive AR, when in a ranked match, if we can manage the bullets per mag, we can use it as a flex weapon. Since they don't care about mobility, they just need no laser, a good BSA, and if it's possible, a good recoil pattern and a low flinch potentially. They run granulated grip tape
plus strike stock
to increase the bullet spread accuracy, reduce the flinch and the lateral recoil a bit, and then the monolithic suppressor for the range, and then they have a free slot. In Stage 3, since pros weren't on the esports version, we saw some of them use a red dot, but with the esports version, they can use skins with better iron sights, so they usually go for a perk, mostly disable, long shot, sleight of hand from what I've seen. This is definitely a good build for playing passive, and the only bad things with this aren't due to the build, but due to the features of the weapon, which is the recoil pattern and the ammo capacity. I'm not gonna talk about it much since it's pretty easy to explain, but the base build is the same with the laser instead of the disable perk. Technically, the BSA is pretty bad without the laser, which decreases the performances after the 20 to 25 meter mark. Some pros even run a monolithic suppressor without the tactical laser, which objectively ruins the BSA and makes it even worse than what we have on the Fennec build presented earlier. But as I said, they don't want to use laser because it could reveal their precision, so they're pretty much stuck with this. And since CBR4 is one of the best flex SMGs in the game, they keep using it. For those asking why they're not using the Razorback, I'm not 100% sure that on the esports version, they got the post-buff Razorback, and even if they did, CBR4 has the same recoil pattern and flinch for over 18 months now. So changing your main weapon right before Stage 4 is too much of a risk, which would explain why they keep using the CBR4. Since Tectonic's performance last year in Stage 5, many pros started using the Kilo 1-for-1 with a slow build, not necessarily the same build but usually something pretty close. To be fair, that's the only weapon that, statistically speaking, is bad. For context, remember that the Mythic Kilo probably has the best iron sight in the game, if it's not to be right behind the Mythic Krig or any other Mythic you can think of. Also, the Kilo has been meta since March 2022, and many pros were using that as their main weapon because at this moment there was no other incredibly good AR or LMG such as the Kilo. So many pros used that only for about 6 months before the return of the Holger, for example, but even then many kept using the Kilo. And when we finally got some alternative to the Kilo for long-range playstyle, Tectonic decided to build his Kilo as a long-range AR instead of a flex AR like we'd do. But the thing is that pros were used to the Kilo and that learning how to use an LK24 or an UL736 could potentially be a waste of time. So many players keep using this to this day, even if statistically an LK or a UL would be better. Players were so used to the Kilo that it wasn't worth switching to a new weapon since the Kilo isn't too far from an LK or a UL with a build like this. Speaking of UL, the UL736 is not that popular when it comes to ranked because most players prefer to use the Holger 26, Chopper, and the CBR4 because of its ease of use. But obviously, it is a whole different story in the Garena comp scene because most, if not all, pro players will always try to find a way to try out new things to improve and become a better player. Take Omega's Idra and Scatty's mids for example. These two players use AR or LMGs most of the time, and instead of sticking to the only LMG that's normally used in comp, which is the Holger 26, they often use the UL736 in scrims and tournaments. This is because of how powerful the gun can be if used correctly. It can 4-shot an enemy up to 45 meters without range boosting attachments, which takes about 291 milliseconds of time to kill, with a 3-shot potential kill up to 32 meters if you hit the chest, arms, or head. It has an infinite 5-shot kill if the targets are beyond 45 meters, which is still pretty decent. Overall, it's a very good gun because of its insane 3-tap potential range, but it can be punishing to use if you miss some shots because of its slow fire rate.
Here is the build
for the UL736. Pro players choosing the UL736 over the Holger doesn't mean that the Holger is bad or the UL736 is better, because at the end of the day, it is all about personal preference and what weapon you're used to. The Holger 26 is still used by pros around the world because of how good the gun actually is. It has a huge mag capacity, fast mobility, fast fire rate, and easy to control recoil, and the list goes on. What more can you ask for? It can 4-shot an enemy up to 40 meters and 5-shot an enemy up to 62 meters. There's really not much to talk about this weapon because it's always been part of the top weapons every season since its release, and its performance can speak for itself, which makes it the best LMG in the game. What gun makes you feel pro? Let us know down in the comments below. Just to remind you, the HVK30 on paper is the best AR in the game, and you can check out this video to understand why. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.